Alright, hello everybody. So this is a very quick overview of the installation steps for the what I call input-output framework upgrade for the PX4 and Simulink. You should pretty much start and receive access to the PX4 Simulink input-output framework repository on GitHub. Here's the link for it. Hopefully you already can find it. This should be in public access if you are already watching this video. Alright, so this is a work in progress. I am updating documentation as I go, but this should have all of the installation steps that you can go on your own without this video, but I'm just going to be highlighting some of the important parts over here. So again, you can read through all of this. What I'm working on is a Windows 11 desktop. You should probably use Windows 11. I don't know if this will work for any other operating system. Version, everything, it's all up to date, so nothing too special about it. I have also already installed MATLAB. So if you look to the prerequisites, you should be able to install a MATLAB version 2023A. Then the required toolboxes, add-ons, and other things. Again, all of that is part of the default MathWorks tutorial. So if you go to this hyperlink over here, it walks you through all of the steps you need to install and configure the toolbox if you had no modifications to it at all. And I would recommend you going through these things first. You actually have to. Also keep in mind is right now, as of time of recording, we already have 2024A version, so the documentation by default will be for that version, which is the most recent release. So the links that I saved in the repo are for the archived version because all of the instructions are quite different. Alright, so let's start with, I guess, some of the, most important parts. Some of you have done all of this, but I'm just going to redo, essentially starting with cloning the PX4. So let's open, first of all, I have already installed PX4, but for the sake of this, we're just going to do it all over again. So this is specific to you. You can pick anything as long as the path is short enough, because Windows has limitations in how long your file path can be, and it is quite limited. You're going to run into problems if you choose something longer. So the ideal case scenario would be placing your PX4 firmware and toolchain somewhere as close to the top level directory of your C or D drive or any other drive. Then for me, what I created is I have a firmware folder and toolchain folder. And again, these are all the steps that are covered in this tutorial. So you're going to have to install your toolchain, which is Cygwin toolchain version 0.8. It's just straight up installer. You don't actually need to clone anything, but if you did, no problem. You can use that version that is already pre-installed with the PX4 and everything built into it. This one is going to be covered, this optional path that I just personally favor because it separates things and lets you delete and not start from the very scratch. Alright, so if you go to your toolchain folder, what you need to do is you need to run the Cygwin console, or which is going to be just double clicking on your run console.bat. And then, so you are opening the terminal window in this directory that you just clicked on it, where the .bat file is. You don't know about it, so what you need to do for my case, again, because I have installed I want to install my PX4 somewhere externally. So I'm just going to cd out, so cd is to move it to a different directory. Now I actually see that, oh, I was in the toolchain folder. So I need to do this again. Now I'm outside and I want to just go and create, I already created this, but I have this firmware folder. where I just basically write some. I have multiple versions that I'm working on, so it's very convenient to keep those separate out. So in Windows, it just literally looks like this. So for now, what we're going to do is let's create some test folder. I don't know. Let's just keep it short again. So I'm just going to do 0.0 because I'm going to delete it right after. All right, so we created a folder. We go into that, and then we follow again the standard instructions linked over here, which are again specific to this upgrade. If you used any other MATLAB version, especially the more recent one, you're going to have to use a different firmware version, and none of these instructions and files will be compatible. So this is very version specific. So I mean, quite literally, we just going to copy these lines, which essentially mean that we're going to clone the GitHub repo for the PX4. And this is not super necessary. You can choose any name, but again, since they prefer firmware, I just kept it as the default. But this is the folder where this GitHub repository is going to be cloned into. Shouldn't be relevant, I don't think so, although I never tried any other name for it. Once that's done, we just need to go inside of the cloned repository, check out the appropriate version, because right now, by default, this will clone the master branch, which we don't want to use because we need a very specific release. Alright, so we are going to git clone v1.12.3. Oops. Oh, not clone, of course. Check out. Of course, you can just copy the commands right there. So this is replacing and checking out the correct version of the repository that we're going to use. Then there is something important for, especially for PX4, we need to initialize all of the modules and everything. Actually, let's wait a little. No, this is good. All right, so we just need to run the initialization for the repository. So we need to update all of the modules, submodules, and everything else. So this may take a little bit just to download and set everything up, but shouldn't cause any problems. Again, don't try to do this through, for example, any other prompt, I mean, like PowerShell or command prompt, just any other terminal. You need to do it through SIMULINK, just because it's not going to support the exact features and everything that this repository needs, so it has to be through SIMULINK. It has to be through the SIMULINK environment. So it's the tool chain that allows us to compile and set everything up for something that has nothing to do with Windows. Alright, so once we have cloned, and I'm just going to go back to the repository that we were talking about. Whoops. So the next step is, well, again, this assumes that you can walk through everything on your own, but we're just going to do that, which is basically following, again, this top level tutorial right here. So we have, what are we doing right now is we're using SIMULINK to build PX4 in Windows, and we are using this help page, downloading PX4 source code as standalone in Windows. The rest is not as relevant. You're not going to use Ubuntu for any of this work. If you do, again, up to you. And all of the other setups are specific to what you're trying to do, but for the RRTV, which is what this repository is configured for, we are going to have some special instructions that you can essentially skip everything below and follow this video or the instructions in the repository. All right, I'm just going to pause this real quick and wait. Oh, never mind. This is done. All right. So we have completed. We haven't really compiled anything yet, so we haven't really done anything useful except of just preparing our PX4 firmware, which is again the stock unmodified firmware. So what we need to do now is go to open up MATLAB 2023A and do the setup for the UAV Toolbox, or I guess PX4 UAV Toolbox support that we have already installed. You could have, again, I have used it, so I'm not going to reinstall that. There's nothing special about it. It's literally following MathWorks instructions. So what you need to do, you need to go to your add-ons and look for this. Yes, UAV Toolbox support package for PX4 Autopilots. Click on this setup gear icon, and this is going to open up the configuration tool. Let me just close all of this. Alright, so this actually walks you through all of the needed steps. So once again, all of this is standard. You don't need to modify anything except for, again, you need to specify where you have installed your toolchain, which I already did this. So you basically specify, again, for me, D drive PX4, letter T standing just for the toolchain. It's going to check a few things. This also runs some other scripts in the background, so this is one more reason not to use the default cloned PX4 that sits inside of the toolchain if you have cloned it already. So if you go to your toolchain, there's going to be a home directory, and probably yours may have PX4 already cloned and set up. So I don't like using that because it overrides this. I mean, this setup process overwrites and deletes a lot of pretty much all the modifications that you've done to your firmware. It may or may not. I don't know actually about 2023. I used it in the 2022A, and that's what it was doing. I think they got rid of it, but I haven't really confirmed that. Anyway, so this is verified. Then it tells you, asks you to specify where is your firmware that you're trying to use, so you can browse. And we know right now we just cloned a fresh firmware into this directory over here. So I'm just going to go inside of the firmware directory, select this folder. Well, that just closed it. Well, actually, never mind. I don't need the firmware. All I need is a directory where the folder firmware sits in. I think it looks for a specific directory. Yes, really all it does is just checks out a few things for the version and stuff in the CMake file, but not necessarily things that you changed or anything like that. Alright, so we go to next, which is basically you have to keep a default. This is for designing flight control system in Simulink. This is going to erase everything that is control system related. So here at this step, again, we're doing everything for the PX4 cube orange. So you have to select this and then use the default CMake. Keep the default, again, startup script. We're not going to modify that. We don't need to modify it. You should have already installed Q ground control. If you haven't, you can again use these hints to install the correct software, then verify the installation, and then go next. You don't need to do anything here, really, just ignore this part. Alright, so this is where it's important. This is changing throughout releases, so different MATLAB version. But the logic here is I always leave this checked on, and this is here by default for this version, which is nice. For the future releases, this is unchecked. But basically, if we change the firmware in any way and we have to redo this setup screen a couple of times or at any point, it's better just to start from scratch and delete the build directory either manually or through, again, checking this checkbox. So this is going to wipe the build directory inside of your firmware. If it doesn't fully clean it, so if I go, for example, to some of the other versions that I used, if I go to firmware, when you build, everything sits inside of this build directory, and you're always welcome to delete all of these things because these are different configurations that you have compiled for. This is also going to contain your binaries. Sometimes when you're stuck at some error, it just doesn't compile for whatever reason, it's useful to just go and delete this build folder manually altogether and start over. It's not going to screw anything up. You'll just have to redo this hardware setup once again, which you have to do anyway if you have changed anything in the firmware. Alright, so we're just going to click on this build, and basically you see it really runs a couple of commands which are pretty much similar to if you were to go inside of SIGWIN, and if you were not using MATLAB, you could have done something like make PX4 orange, Cubopilot orange. I think default. It doesn't really list it here, you don't see it, but this is pretty much what it runs. The key part is that you have to do it through this hardware setup app because it also runs other tasks and items that are specific to MATLAB and the toolbox that you're trying to configure. So this will not be sufficient. Do not try to use this shortcut of running it through the terminal, through this SIGWIN terminal. It looks like it may work in some cases, but you may run into problems later on. Some files may no longer be compatible. You may run into problems. I have tried to do it in the past. It seemed to work, but there are some issues where you do need to restart and go through this hardware setup app every single time something has changed in the PX4 firmware. And again, just to reiterate while we are waiting for it to compile, you have cloned your firmware. If you make any manual changes here to any of these files, anything whatsoever, doesn't matter, not to your Simulink model. Again, forget about Simulink model right now. Anything here, anything to the source code of the PX4 PX4 firmware itself. If you have changed anything or installed some upgrade package from anybody else or from me, you have to start this hardware setup app all over again and do this firmware building step, ideally from scratch. It's just you're going to save yourself more time by doing it from scratch, from absolute zero, than trying to take a shortcut and maybe not compile all of the files that you need, but only the ones that have changed. Do not do that. Just go through the full hardware setup screen. This hardware setup app. And as you can see, it's a lot of files. I mean, this number is going to be different if you're using something other than the stock PX4 firmware. Right now we're compiling the stock version. So you should see pretty much the same numbers, but I'm just going to keep it running for a little bit so you can reference with your build process, because, excuse me, this should be pretty much identical for everybody. Also, it does not matter where you are, like if you have anything loaded into your MATLAB right now. I do obviously recommend to just have a clean workspace, don't have anything that may potentially conflict with something related to this process, although I have not really ran into any problems. But yeah, so this may take a little bit longer depending again on your computer processor, because this is quite long. in a more recent firmware release. MATLAB release. It uses a more recent firmware of the PX4, and it lets you use WSL environment, which is way better, way faster, but again, we're not going to cover it here. Alright, so while that is going, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the repository. Alright, so the installation part that is actually directly related to this repository. So what you need to do is, if you want to install this Simulink input-output framework integration package, basically what it is, it's literally a folder. If you go to, so on your GitHub page, you can do it manually through just the website. That's probably the easiest one for folks who are not used to GitHub. On the right, you're going to see a releases tab. Right now it only has one release, but in case in the future there are going to be multiple, I'm just going to do it for one specific release, which is going to have this label. So it's ROTV version 1. It only has the source code because this is all you need. And this specifies the version that it's compatible with. And pretty much all of the instructions on this page should be for that version and everything related to that. In the future, I may continue to upgrade and update this, but the releases will be kept, meaning that this will be kept. So you can always go back to the source code. So the source code is essentially a timestamp copy of the entire GitHub repository. So everything here. All right, so we can, if you just click on this, again, if you're for whatever reason using Linux, you can use that, but basically let's get the source code. This is just a zip folder with, well, whenever it downloads, but basically you can use also the GitHub desktop application that I recommend personally. It just saves you a lot of time and pain for manual copying, pasting, and opening websites or doing through the terminal. You can add clone a repository. And if you go back over here, code, you can copy this URL, this one over here. Then go back to your GitHub repository. You're going to have a lot less things, or I mean just different number. But basically you need to clone a new repository, paste this in here, because this is github.url. Let's just do URL. Alright, yes, so, and then specify where you want to install this. This doesn't matter in terms of the file lengths or whatever. This is literally just downloading the files. I already have it. Let's do this PX4 Simulink. This is it. Alright, so now I already cloned it. If you are doing it much later, basically you should switch to, or basically through the GitHub app, the main branch is going to be again development. So this is going to have new stuff that is probably not even compatible with what you're trying to do. You need to select this specific branch over here. This is RTV R2023A Transcend. This is sort of directly related to this release. So this is where I am right now. So if I go to my GitHub folder where I cloned it, yes, so you're going to see these files. This is the exact same thing that you download manually. So you see this folder. If I open it up, it is going to be the exact same stuff. Well, maybe in a different order. The important part here is I keep a copy. Again, this is something that is probably specific to how you install things. Again, this is more related to Q ground control and just that compatibility, but I just keep the driver that worked for me. So this is again just a Windows driver for some of the serial devices, or specifically for PixHawk stuff. So you may want to reinstall or install it using this driver, or a more recent version, but just search for that online. Alright, so this has essentially only one folder that you should worry about. Everything else is just GitHub related stuff. The README that you are looking at online is literally here, just I guess in a text format. All right, so the installation steps are really straightforward, and they're outlined over here. So again, assuming you start with the clone PX4 firmware of a certain version. Let's actually check on that part. Okay, so we actually completed. Okay, good. So we can do that. All right, so you see in your MATLAB screen. So while I was talking, we have, so you're going to see these warnings. These are just Mavlink related stuff. The C++ doesn't really like the things that were done in Mavlink because they're not safe or whatever, but they work. I mean, this is how it's supposed to be. So disregard all of the Mavlink. These are warnings. Again, these are warnings. It just says that this is not quite a legal way of doing things in the C++ standard that it's using now, which is totally fine. All right, so you've done it. Again, linking, you have a whole bunch of files. You compiled the firmware upgrade too. I mean, this is all correct. Or I guess you compiled the bootloader. You see this is 257 files for the bootloader. No problem. Don't need to worry about it again. So you see this screen at the end. And everything is done. Again, as an additional confirmation here. Everything is successful. All right, so the next steps is you can upload this right now. This is not really needed. You don't need to. You don't even need to have the hardware board connected to it. You can essentially skip this step if you know what you're doing, which, I mean, for now, we don't care about it. You can also go through the examples. If you're doing it for the first time, I would actually recommend you upload it to the board through this screen over here. Run some examples, again, for the default firmware, the stock one, and make sure that things work the way they should work, because that's something I can't really help you, because that's just, again, some issues that you may run into are literally specific to how you installed MATLAB or anything else on your specific computer. All right, so we're not going to run examples. Okay, so we're done. And this is the starting point essentially for this repository. It assumes that you already have done some work and you know what you're doing with the PX4 Toolbox, but this is just a very quick recap of things. All right, so install PX4 Simulink input-output upgrade. So the very first part, again, you need to know where you have installed, and I'm going to update this because this is a little wrong. Yes, the 13 version is the more recent one that is for PX4, R2024. Alright, so this is this is just things that are already written multiple times, so sometimes I make a typo. Anyway, alright, so the first thing you need to do, again, know where you have installed things. I went through that. Alright, so now the very first really installation step is here. You need to go into your firmware that we just cloned, the stock one. Alright, so let's go to alright, so yes, so this is where we have installed it, PX4 well, not 12. We have installed it here. Alright, so this is our stock PX4 firmware. We go to sources, drivers, and then we have to delete everything related to CAN. I guess not everything. I didn't see this in the past, but basically delete this UAV CAN version 1, and UAV CAN node folders. Just delete them. Alright, so once you've done it, you should have already cloned it or cloned the PX4 firmware. The firmware upgrade. So this is what I've done. In the downloads, I extracted the folder, the GitHub repo, and what we need is this firmware folder. You just literally copy, go to the full PX4 firmware, top level directory of your installation, copy, paste. What this does, it replaces and adds files that are needed. What we've done, we deleted some of the files that are actually screwing up the installation because the UAV CAN stuff has been updated and it's no longer compatible with the PX4 version 12.3, 1.12.3. All right, so this is really it. As I mentioned, whenever we change the firmware, we need to go and redo the UAV Toolbox support package for PX4 Autopilots setup screen. Did I forget anything? Yes, this is outlined over here. Yes, so the last step is to, again, recompile. Right, we are going to verify installation. And you just have to do it every time, unfortunately. PX4 version, yes, this is correct. This should not cause any problems. If you are, well, I'm going to talk a little bit in a second about this, simply because nothing is changing. So this may actually change for whatever reason, so always keep in mind that you have to switch to Cube Orange. And then all of the changes to the CMake compilations were done to the default script. So again, you just select the default that is already pre-selected once you do select the PX4 Cube Orange. Startup script, don't modify that. Verify installation. Next, no need to do anything here. Again, so I recommend just deleting the build directory through this step. So build firmware with this one still checked. All right, so let's actually see, because I haven't done it in a long time and they may have updated some of the modules that are no longer compatible, but this is not supposed to happen anymore, hopefully. So this is going to restart this whole process again. This is perfectly fine. Let me just close. Okay, so what I was talking about is your firmware. Sorry, this upgrade. Let's talk a little bit about this. So as you noticed, I'm not even plugging in the board yet. So forget about the hardware. For now, we're just preparing the firmware. So for now, let's focus on that. So in terms of very, very quick overview, all of the modules and functionality that has been added by me, it's basically all ran automatically on startup. Once you upload the firmware to the board, even if it doesn't have the SD card, it's going to be started automatically. That has been incorporated into the firmware itself. So you don't need to worry about any startup scripts. And I would actually recommend not including any startup scripts that are custom and wiping the entire SD card before you even run anything if you have used custom startup scripts or used your board in the past. The startup routines are all in this ROMFS folder. If you go to initialized D, this is for the actual PXHawk. You can take a look into all of these files. Basically, it just starts the module and then disables a couple of things and enables a couple of things just to make it all work correctly. It's pretty minimal, but these files have to be modified just to get it all consistent. Also, this firmware implements a custom frame for a tilt wing, which is RRTV configuration. So you can go to RRTV. It doesn't really have anything special that we're relying on, except for just making sure that there are no additional settings loaded in the background that may conflict with anything. But we'll cover that later when we upload it all to the board. Alright, so in terms of important stuff, again, so this CMake file that I wanted to talk about it, if you again go to your firmware boards, and by the way, so in your actual firmware directory that the upgrade was installed to, the reason I'm not looking into it because it's just a lot bigger, but it should have the same files, right? We just copied all of those and replaced the original files with it. It's just not to confuse you. You see the boards, there are a lot more. You can check things that have been modified and upgraded. Alright, so if you go into the firmware, let's talk a little bit about the CMake, because that's basically where your settings for compilation of different modules are. And if you go to your boards, in this case CubePilot, Cube Orange, just keep in mind again, so MATLAB, like by default, you're just gonna have one or multiple files called whatever, like default or maybe some other configuration .cmake. For CubePilot, it's just going to be one file, like default CMake. At least that's the one that we care about. If you go to the actual firmware, let me get there, boards. CubePilot, Cube Orange. Yeah, so you see there are a lot more settings and things that are changed. I'm just not going to modify it, so I don't have it. But basically, let's talk about this. So original file is something that MATLAB creates. What it does is when it doesn't see one like this, it takes a copy of the default .cmake in this case, appends it with .original, and it's just a backup. Next time when you rerun the setup app, what it will do, it sees this .original, it copies the content of it back into the default, or back into the original CMake. So everything here will get replaced by this one. So if you're making any changes at any point to the CMake file, don't forget to update both of these. That's why I'm including both over here in the upgrade package, because this is something that people get confused about. They're basically the same. Like if I were to open these two, they are literally the same text files, except that the CMake, no, they are the same. Never mind. Yeah, they're exactly the same. The one in your firmware, after you have compiled, may be different, but that's okay. Don't worry about that part. Alright, so what we need to do now is let's go back to the firmware. Okay, that has been compiled successfully. We just literally step through all of these. Alright, and if at any point you feel like you want to upload, or like you don't need to use that setup app to upload anything, or I guess to get your binary that you just generated, all of the binaries will be in, if you go to your firmware, build directory, we just compile this CubePilot, Cube Orange default, and then here in the top level sort of directory of this build tree, you're going to find, yes, the same name, appended was .px4. This is the binary. This is the only file that you need if you were to upload something through, for example, QGC, Q ground control, to the PXHawk. That's the only file you need. Not any of the other ones. Don't use those. This .px4. You can keep a copy of this because everything else is only needed for compiling it. Once it's done and linked, you generate a single executable, or binary in this case. Yeah, I mean, that's basically it. Okay, so at this point, we're done. We have successfully compiled it, and it's all clear. So we're going to talk about other things and how to actually integrate it into the Simulink in a separate video that is related to pretty much directly talking about the RTV tilt wing configuration.